Hello and welcome everyone to this special In Conversation session with award-winning Irish author Caoilinn Hughes. I am Natasha and I am part of the BorrowBox content team here based in Melbourne, Australia. And we begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we're meeting, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And we pay our respects to all elders past, present and emerging and acknowledge them as the original storytellers of the land. Our guest, Caoilinn Hughes, grew up on the west coast of Ireland and obtained a PhD from Victoria University in Wellington in New Zealand and is currently the Oscar Wilde Centre Writer Fellow at Trinity College in Dublin. She is a poet, a short story writer and a novelist. Her first published novel was Orchid and the Wasp, and that was in 2018, which won the Collier-Bristow Prize in 2019 and was shortlisted for the Hearst Big Book Award and the Butler Literary Award. Her second novel, The Wild Laughter, was published in 2020 and won the 2021 Encore Award and was longlisted for the 2021 Swansea University International Dylan Thomas Prize and was shortlisted for several other awards, including the Delkey Emerging Writer Literary Award. Her recent novel, The Alternatives, was published by Bloomsbury earlier this year, and Belinda is proud to have worked on the exclusive audiobook recording. Welcome, Caoilinn.
Hi, Natasha. Thanks so much for having me.
I have loved all of your books. I find that they are intelligent yet accessible. And one of the interesting threads I've found through each of them is that they're dealing with big global issues, but through a very intimate lens of sibling relationships. So in The Orchid and the Wasp, we have Gail and Guthrie, whose family are affected by the global financial crash. And then in The Wild Laughter, a similar circumstance with the crash, but this time with Hart and Cormac, the two very problematic brothers, and also dealing with other issues that impact on that family. But here in The Alternatives, we're now in 2023, and we're looking at four sisters who known as the Flattery sisters. They have tragically lost their parents when they were in their teens, and now in 2023, they're in their 30s and trying to navigate life and work and relationships. And it's all touching on things that they're interested in through their work. So climate change, Brexit, food scarcity, mental illness, physical illness, the fact of being a working woman, a working mother. There's so much to think about, but one of the things was that it seems so accessible. And the other thread that I found interesting was that all of these siblings, in navigating all of these situations, are doing it with parents who are absent or neglectful. So I just wondered, what has been your fascination of having kind of a familial focus as a way into the writing of the stories that you wanted to tell?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah, my parents weren't neglectful at all, but I'm not writing autofiction.
No.
With this novel, I suppose I'll come back to the kind of general question around why I keep writing about family and adult siblings. With this novel, it was more of an instinct than anything that the parents weren't there. And when I first met Alwyn, the geologist character, when I started writing, and I kind of knew off the bat that she was a big sister, and then I started to glean that she had brought her sisters up, and so I kind of accepted that from her character that their parents had been absent. And then when I finished the book, I realized that it made so much sense to have this book be about women who grew up without adults in the room, who are maybe very well primed for the moment that we're living in. So, it's funny how these things make sense, or at least you reverse justify them afterwards. But yeah, I can't stop writing about adult sibling dynamics. I need to find a new trick.
I don't think so, because I think each of them are so unique in the way that you explore that. I mean, interestingly, the way that they love each other, care for each other, I mean, make decisions for each other, whether the other siblings like it or not, and how they might annoy each other. I think it's so unique in the way that it's been explored in all of those texts, but particularly in this one with the Flattery sisters, because you've got 4 sisters, and I'm one of 3 as well, also the eldest, like Olwen. Was it, you mentioned that Olwen was your way into the story. Was that the reason why you start with her in the opening chapter? And did she come to you as a sort of fully formed character that you knew where her trajectory of her story was going to go? Or as you were drafting, you kind of were having discoveries along the way?
Yes, my process is to write into the dark with no notes, no plan, and I kind of write in one draft. So that's that's another kind of conversation.
Right.
But I did start with Alwyn, and it took me a long time to kind of to brave up to writing this book. I remember calling a Dutch writer friend of mine, Bette Adrianse, during COVID, well, very kind of beginning of COVID, and saying, I just want a different novel idea. This is going to take years. I don't know that I can do it. Who's going to want to read this? And it's 4 sisters who have PhDs and none of them have husbands. Like bestseller, here I come. And she kind of, she said, Caoilinn, you have something in your garden, and it might be ugly and poisonous, and you might not want to go there and tend to it. But until you see it through to fruition, nothing else can grow in your garden. There's
Mm.
something there. And it was kind of what I needed to hear, because I just needed to roll up my sleeves and brace myself. I think partly I didn't know how things would play out, and it is a little daunting when you're dealing with climate change. In a novel that's not set in the future, that's set now. And you're guiding a reader through someone who works in that field and the people who love her, who are very exposed, I suppose, to the consequences of constantly thinking about the situation we're in, and how, if possible, we can get out of it or improve it,
Mm.
the trajectory. And so that kind of, I was a little intimidated by that. But then Alwyn arrived, this geologist who's been living on the west coast of Ireland, with her big kind of boomy voice, and she's, I think, quite funny.
Mm.
And so in a way, like, she convinced me that that she'll hold her own, that I needn't doubt her in a way, no matter how much she might seem to be wobbling. And so I was also writing the book on the west coast of Ireland, where I grew up, in Connemara. I was writing most of the book, and that landscape, I know you've been, we were talking a little bit
Mm.
beforehand, to Galway, but that landscape out in Connemara, like, which is really on the coast. As a child, I used to throw bottles of, water bottles. Now this is terrible. You're talking about climate change, but with notes in them, to try and get a pen pal in America, because it is next stop America, there. And so there's something kind of existential about the landscape, not only because of the vast expanse of sea, which in Australia you'll know all about, but also because of the geology, which is very much to the fore in that landscape. You see the rocks, the granite shouldering through the fields. The soil is quite thin, and it's troublesome in terms of growing crops, and there's a lot of peat as well. So this dense, compacted, watery landscape, and there's no trees there. There used to be an endemic forest, so you can see all of this rock. And it occurred to me that a geologist would be a fascinating character in terms of my own sets of interest, and also because it's very existential work, looking at the landscape and trying to understand how it came to be that way, and what its history is, what kind of life it's accommodated, and also, what its future moves might be, with or without us. And so there's that was kind of that came with Alwyn's way of thinking. And also a little bit, it reflected Alwyn's character, in that the landscape is so kind of wild and dynamic, but somehow immovable, or there's
Mm.
something kind of very permanent about it, and so that kind of fit in with Alwyn. And then, yeah, as I say, she had this big sister energy, and so like, I came to understand that I probably would meet the other sisters, and I didn't yet know that that the book would actually be weighted equally with them all. I had thought of Alwyn as being the protagonist, but in terms of page count, they do get equal weighting.
Yeah, I look forward to talking about those other sisters as they came. so much there. One, that the fact that you sent out those, little notes in bottles. I mean, now, obviously, all these years later, you kind of would be getting word from America, I would say, fans of your books that are perhaps not sending a bottle back, but at least emailing back how much they love your work. And that big sister energy is something that completely captivated me with Alwyn when we first see her as a university lecturer with her students, as an ex-teacher, those conversations that are happening with her students. And she's quite encouraged by them and their interest and their hopefulness with being concerned with what's happening and wanting to learn. I mean, it was so authentic, those conversations. And she feels in the sort of spontaneous field trip that they take, and she kind of is encouraged by their interest and wants to kind of shape that. I think it's really interesting. It might be timely actually to use this as a moment to sort of tap into you doing a reading of part of that opening chapter with Alwyn. I don't know if you need to set anything up here.
Thanks so much. Yeah, no, I don't actually. That's the benefit of reading from the opening. So you'll hear she's in the middle of a lab. I should have brought it up on the screen, so I'm not looking away. But the air is mild for October. Nothing shivers, nothing smokes. A gentle westerly whistles at the panes of the lab windows like an unwelcome uncle, determined to raise the hairs on some young neck. 20 necks bend to observe the experiment. A perspex prism, known as the squeeze box, the size of a narrow aquarium, is filled with thin layers of coloured sand. So this is meant to be a little bit demonstrative of the squeeze box, or it's inspired by it. The ends of the box are movable so that its contents can be compressed to demonstrate the effects of tectonic convergence. Thrusts, faults, folds, belts. Excuse me. Alwyn presses a fist to her mouth to stifle a burp, and a few students snicker. Lo and behold, geologic processes for the puny human attention span. There's something very bodily about Alwyn flattery that the undergraduates find wildly amusing. Moments earlier, she'd used a shard of slate to scratch her inner elbow psoriasis, and a puff of dead skin particles had danced visibly in the ventilation. She placed the shard back in the tray and, with her chalky fingers, lifted out a teeny tiny sanitized kidney stone for the undergraduate's scrutiny. Moving this kidney stone involved a person's hospitalization. Just imagine the force it would take to move a mountain. And we're not talking about violent, sudden processes, like an earthquake shouldering up a mountain range. No. These forces are so incremental and immense, so imperceivable and unstoppable. There's no halting their progress. They're underway right now, as we stand here on the shifting foundations of this institute. The students scan their pals for clues as to how to feel. They have learned to take what levity they can from these light and flaky moments, as Alwyn's lectures so far have been something of a shockwave. We're a wreck, she says. Ireland is one big crash site, where the ancient continents, Laurentian and Gondwana, collided like two humongous cruise liners, long before the nouveau riche were evolved to populate them. The wreckage cuts stupendously across this island, from Dingle in the west to Clogherhead in the east. The island was underwater back then, so that story didn't make itself known for millions of years. But here we stand, sifting through the evidence of that collision in our desk organisers, all of us above sea level, for another decade or two anyways. Several students begin to agitate in the pause that follows. It's hard to read the undergraduates, to know what's getting through, what with the scarves cobraed around their mouths and their minimal eye contact. They all seem hungover or stoned or just returned from a silent monetary meditation retreat in Bali they spent their loans on, but they also seem deeply unnerved, and it's not paranoia. How information is delivered seems to be more consequential than the information itself, Alwyn thinks. She's losing her strength to hand it over gently. But a teacherly muscle memory prompts her now, having pushed, to pull. Have any of you seen it? She makes eye contact with each student in turn, in case, as first years, they need drawing out. Shauna, an exchange student with the gall of a parking enforcement officer, asks, Is it here in Galway? Because car rental in this country is a joke. It's not in the immediate vicinity, Shauna, but I saw the Rock of Gibraltar, Eric offers out of nowhere, a very tall student with asteroidal confidence. Alwyn hears the clock on the wall tick forward a cluster of seconds all in one go, like heart palpitations. Harmless, but horrible. If you tell me you flew down to see the Rock of Gibraltar, Eric, when you haven't taken a bus to Dingle to ogle our own monumental bodies of rock. In the pause that follows, Eric takes a seat and runs his fingers through his gelled hair, leaving striations that seem almost infrastructural, as if water might collect in them. Alwyn is grateful when Fionnuala, not technically a mature student, but she has a lot of cop on, cuts in with something likely to be relevant. I went to Edinburgh during the festival. Oh, sorry. I went to Edinburgh during the summer. For the festival? Geraldine clenches with envy. Yeah, says Fionnuala, but we took a day trip to Sicker Point. She glances at Alwyn. You did not. Alwyn replaces a chunk of granite she'd been using as a stress ball back in the specimen tray, readying herself to shake Fionnuala's hand. Fionnuala smiles. Fionnuala, by the way, is in a wheelchair, but we don't find that out here. It was a little tricky to get out onto the rock, but it was worth it. Alwyn looks around the group. Does anyone know what historic expedition Fionnuala was honouring, trekking out to Sicker Point on Scotland's weather-battered coast, when she could have stayed in Edinburgh town to watch shit-faced Shakespeare? Do you want to say, Fionnuala, what you saw there, and who saw it first? Fionnuala pulls at a mini harmonica pendant, travelling it back and forth along the necklace. By the end of year one, Alwyn will count herself a failure if Fionnuala hasn't replaced that pendant with a hand lens. Fionnuala acts a touch more flustered than she is. So James Hutton, I guess, back in the 1700s, he found these rock formations, these really crazy layered rocks, kind of like pastry, or maybe I just associate Scotland with pastry. Sedimentary rock, like the strata of coloured sands, Alwyn gestures, in our squeezebox experiment. Exactly, yeah. And there were these horizontal layers like that, and then vertical sections too, side by side or on top of one another at right angles. And the vertical rocks and the horizontal formed in totally different ways, in different time periods. And Hutton basically looked at those rocks and instantly understood plate tectonics, or a theory that led to it? Or is it just that he knew that the earth, the center of the earth was molten rock, and that was how new land was made? Because instead of, God making it, Fionnuala keeps glancing to Alwyn for confirmation. Because before that, she presses on, he could see erosion happening and couldn't understand how all land hadn't been just like washed away by the weather. Like, how was there anything left? And the only explanation anyone knew for new land was God. But when Hutton saw those rocks, he knew they were evidence that the earth was billions of years old instead of thousands, because the formations would have taken like a really, really long time. At Fionnuala's unsure expression, Alwyn nods with the pride of a surgeon confirming that they got it all, that the patient has plenty of life ahead. I'll leave it there.
Her voice is so captivating. And the other thing I love about your writing is how observational it is. And there's a real humor that comes through as well. They're dealing with quite serious topics in their class, but the interactions of the teacher with the students is just quite funny, with the way that she's observing the students and the situation and herself. And that just comes through the whole book. So it doesn't feel as heavy to understand what's happening. Obviously, when she moves, she goes home, and that kind of encouragement and positivity, it switches. We learn a bit more about Alwyn. She does like a drink, indeed. And there's a bit of a despondency that creeps in, and she will end up escaping her life and disappearing, as it were, for a period of months. And this then brings into play the rest of the sisters, who are now worried about her whereabouts and trying to find her. She talks about to her students about the soil being around a long time, but that it's being ruined by our current need for burgers, which I think is a really nice little droplet that is picked up in the next chapter when we meet Maeve, who is a celebrity chef. Do you just want to touch on a bit on who is Maeve as Olwen's sister and why that kind of indication of where her concerns lay with her job?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so Maeve is the person that we meet immediately after we meet Alwyn, and they're very different. And I think Maeve's the one that most friends have written to say they identify as.
Right.
Or so I've had
She's the cool Instagrammer, so that's not a surprise there.
I guess she's the one who struggles the most to kind of marry her her behavior in the world with her kind of principles, and like and it's I think maybe people also relate to that, whereas say Nell, who's a philosopher, it seems I think of her as being more equivalent to an artist, in the sense that it's a really, really difficult way to make your life work kind of financially, and there's a lot of, and it's there's a lot of challenges and reasons not to do it, and also kind of feelings of guilt is whenever things are really tough, is this really how I should be? Am I actually useful here? All those sorts of big questions and how you're spending your life come up, I think, in a similar way when you're kind of living the life of the mind. But Nell is very kind of, she's very, very sure about it being the very best way to spend her life. And she's, even though she's the most circumstantially uncomfortable, she's the most kind of enthusiastic to get back to her work and, and satisfied within it. Maeve is very stimulated by her work. She lives on a houseboat in London with a Bosnian mime artist who lives in a tent on her deck, and she's kind of accidentally wound up with this very unusual career. She loves cooking, and that was kind of vocational. She started out cooking when their parents died, and she kind of traded with her sisters that she didn't want to clean toilets and she didn't want to change the bed sheets, but that she would do this thing, which
Sounds
also
like my husband, which is a very smart idea for him.
But it comes with I guess, a financial responsibility too. But she actually took on more responsibility than she gave herself credit for, because she would be deciding, well, this punnet of tomatoes has this many tomatoes in, and can I stretch some of them into tomorrow's meal, making all those kind of decisions that go with cooking. It's never just, you can't, a profession is never isolated from the other aspects of life. And I think now all professions, for example, are brush up against issues of climate change. I was trying to think of a single profession last night, doing an event that doesn't, but even I was thinking, like, if you were cleaning toilets, even then you might find that people are taking shelter more frequently in the summer months, and the toilet, like this, there's every job, I think, brushes up against it. And so Maeve's eventually does too, and probably encouraged by the fact that she has this big sister who she really reveres, and so Alwyn has been sending Maeve some articles over the past few years about food scarcity and about because Maeve really works with local produce, and she's thinking, and that becomes really tricky when Brexit happens, because the local produce becomes kind of real, in a sense that well, what if Britain doesn't come through with decent trade deals, and we do actually have to cook with what we can grow? Like, what does that look like? So it goes from a hypothetical into something possible, and so she starts to write. She's approached by a publisher because of her Instagram platform. Maybe I should say how that comes about. She starts to make these Instagram live videos with her sister Nell, the philosopher, because Nell is a little bit homesick, or at least Maeve likes to think that Nell is homesick, and they start doing these kind of collaborative videos where Maeve will be cooking really early in the morning when she was living in a shared house, and she's she starts cooking at like 5 a.m. to cater, And so in the quiet of the morning, she's got her, she has to be really quiet. And Nell has chronic insomnia and is on the other side of, of the ocean in Connecticut. And Nell will kind of philosophize and do her writing kind of partly using Maeve's cooking as kind of ASMR, like a inspo, and like background noise. And so they have that, and it becomes a kind of channel called Meals and Meditations, and it kind of blows up. And so Maeve is approached to write a series of cookbooks and around Brexit Britain. And we meet her when she has submitted her final manuscript, which she's called Feasting on Scarcity, and the publishers obviously do not like this, and they've threatened to renege on the deal. And so we meet her in a moment where she can't actually give back the advance, and so they kind of have a little bit of control over her when we meet her, and she's kind of got this dilemma going on.
It's interesting, the idea that these women are really academically successful and in their careers quite successful, but financial success is not a guarantee, and even romantic success is not a guarantee. And that's, some of it's by choice, like you've said. With Maeve, obviously, in a relationship with Nell, and at that pivot point where she's thinking about her own career, like, is she useful, as you were saying, she touches on how Nell is the brilliant Broke philosopher that you mentioned, but also Nell is tackling quite personal issues to do with health. And it kind of actually, again, as a precursor to the chapter that then we'll then see Nell uniquely speaking for herself, because we hear about this from Maeve, it kind of already develops our empathy and our admiration for this character that we're yet to meet. So by the time we do meet Nell, the youngest of the Flattery sisters, who has gone to Connecticut, as you say, and quite removed, we already have an inkling of what her situation is. But here she is, again, working in a university, teaching philosophy, dealing with personal health issues. It touches on not just the heartbreaking reality of not having affordable healthcare, but also maybe, does she regret or not being away from her homeland, or perhaps more the relationship with her sisters, and she's quite at peace where she is. That theme of regret against being in a country that can't seem to give her the affordable healthcare that might be easier if she was at home.
It would be easier for sure, because part of the reason that she can't afford any healthcare, it's obviously the US is appalling with the healthcare system, but she's in an especially difficult situation because she's on a particular type of visa, and so the premiums are untenable. So yes, she's in a very precarious position. She's in the most precarious position. She's adjuncting at 3 different universities. Her courses keep being kind of cancelled and changed. So when she was teaching, the history of Stoicism last year, now she's teaching self-help and happiness. The courses keep kind of broadening to accommodate a wider group of students across disciplines, and she's fighting kind of commercialization in the academy. And in one of the colleges, she's very good friends with the dean, who we meet, Ron, and so we get to witness a little bit of that, what the realities of trying to push back against that trend, that corporatization, and also just the squeezing of the humanities. But she's very determined and dedicated, and really believes very deeply in what she's doing. And so she knows that to get a position anywhere teaching philosophy is becoming harder and harder. So she's, in a way, she can't really afford to regret. She's, or to think through alternatives. There isn't really the space, because she's clinging on to this thing that she so values. Yeah, so one of the things I hope that the reader can experience with the book is the fact that we meet the sisters separately in their individual lives, and they have been leading very distant lives. It's Alwyn's disappearance in the opening chapter of the novel, and she does send them a text saying, "Don't try and find me," but it is that brings them all together for the first time in years. They haven't been together since Nell's 30th, which is about 3.5 years before the book takes place. And so, but hopefully the reader can sense that what it's like, in any family situation where we are in our individual lives and we feel kind of, ourselves and we don't see ourselves kind of fundamentally as a sister who's out doing this thing, this job, you know. And but somehow, as soon as the family come together, it's really, really difficult to maintain that full sense of selfhood and independence that we witnessed as a reader, because we see them completely separate from one another.
Mm.
And then as soon as they're together, it's like, it's interesting how so much of that collapses, and you become kind of a version of the self that gets reflected back at you by the people who know you a certain way, and find it difficult to take on new information about how you are or how you might have changed. And I hope that when the family does come back together, I mean, they do find her. It's not a thriller.
Mm.
um, but when they do come together, that the reader has something like the experience of maybe meeting the in-laws for the first time, where you've heard about them for years, and like you've
Mm.
so many stories, you have a set of expectations about them.
Mm.
And so when you kind of come to meet them as a reader, and you already know so much about the what's not being said, and the dynamics of all the interactions, um, and the challenge of trying to convey and maintain your separateness, and not revert back to a former self, and to dwell back on issues that actually you generally gotten over.
Mm. I think that's such a clever part of the structure, is that we do meet each of the four of them in their own unique chapters, and not just learning about them, but also the people that they're involved with, but also what they think of their siblings. So we hear about, Nell comments about Olwen, that she thinks she's a natural stoic. You were talking about that before, but she doesn't want any praise, and she's been quite the caregiver and is now caring for her own family, and they are existing individually. But the other unique thing is that they do have a relationship with each other through the WhatsApp group chat. And then there's private little relationships that are happening individually, secrets that are held. One of the sisters does, for that whole time, actually know where Olwen was the entire time, where the other two were flummoxed as to where Olwen had been. I think that that's a kind of fun part of the story, where we see how different siblings within a family dynamic, react differently and are different kinds of people. And of course, then we meet in the fourth chapter Rona, who is assured, a fixer. Her voice is completely different again to the other three that we've met before. And I wondered, how did you get into the headspace of each of these women? And was one kind of pushing for more Oya time? You mentioned at the start that you'd started with Olwen and wasn't sure about perhaps even how many sisters she might have, or who these other, women were in her life and how they were interacting. How were they, I suppose, formulating in your headspace with each of these very distinct voices?
Yeah, I guess I'm Rona. I can't remember. I don't think Rona comes up in Alwyn's thinking in the first chapter. Maybe there is a moment where we get something about the ever mercenary Rona, or something like this. So we have a sense, which I guess, if anyone were to read the book a second time, you would see everything differently. But yes, I loved the idea that when I discovered that I was going to be writing multiple sisters, and that in a way, inevitably, then the book would have to do with sisterhood. I loved the idea that it also could be not just a book about sisters, but a book about women at work,
Mm.
because those seem like two separate novels. And they needn't be, a book about fundamentally about what it is to try and do meaningful work, or work that you consider to be meaningful or fulfilling, and centering work in your life, which is maybe it's still thought of as taboo, in a woman's life, and have that simultaneously be about family.
Mm.
That those two realms needn't be kind of separated. I found that very exciting, and galvanizing in a way. So I was, I think Alwyn and Nell, the geologist and the philosopher, were kind of the easiest for me to get into, and in terms of what their research and the types of frame of references that they might have, in terms of their reading and why they do what they do. Maeve, the chef, that was trickier because, well, first of all, I'm vegetarian, and like I guess I eat mostly plant-based, and so she's not. She cooks everything, and so first of all, I had to deal with that, make sure that I wasn't shortchanging the reader on what she might be cooking, but also I'm extremely impatient when I'm cooking, so I kind of want to eat within 30 minutes once I've started cooking. And I'm a terrible multitasker. And I think you have to be good at multitasking to be a chef. And also you need to have a certain type of patience. Maybe chefs don't see it as patience, but but I see it as patience, you know, to
I
kind of
agree with you. It's very, yeah, I'm not the cook in our house, that's for sure.
But then with Rona is a political scientist, and she is she's the most kind of successful on paper, and maybe in many contexts, but she is a tenured professor at Trinity College in Dublin. She is also a single mum, and so she has a 1-year-old called Leo, and but in the background, you know, she's a talking head in Ireland. You know, she's frequently in newspapers, right? You know, in op-eds, being interviewed, and so we don't see her teaching. So 3 of them are teaching, but we see 2 of them teaching. But we don't see Rona in that context. We see her more, you know, negotiating with politicians and in separate realms later in the book. And so she works around direct democracy and tools to enable more participatory democracy, one of them being citizens' assemblies, which are absolutely massive in Ireland. And Ireland happens to be the global kind of leader in citizens' assemblies. And I find them just so fascinating and hopeful as a form of like moving beyond the current kind of deadlocks that we have in democracies. And so I didn't know that would actually be her work. And because I write in one draft, sorry, this is a kind of rambling answer, but I'm trying to bring a few things together. I had an idea of what Rona did, what specific work she did, you know, and then, but I was writing it in 2020, 2021, and even, you know, and before that, and I knew I was setting it in 2023. So I wanted to try and set it when the novel would be published. And I missed by about, you know, 9 months. But I still was having to, so I was trying to capture the present moment, but also anticipate what the future, you know, what was just around the corner. And I didn't want it to be speculative. I didn't want it to be an alternate history. So it meant that I had to change as I was going, and that's very unusual for me. There didn't need to be an awful lot that changed, but Rona's work did. So by in the beginning of the book and the end, some of the field that she was working in, it would have changed because, for example, everything has just been changing so much more quickly, like you know. And so, for example, the Supreme Court in the UK ruling against Scotland's right to have a second referendum on independence, that suddenly changed things for Northern Ireland. You know, because then the precedent was no longer there, or you know, and so it complicated things. So I had to alter what she was doing, and then it always feels fated when you find the right thing, and the thing that the novel is like. It felt like, of course, it's called The Alternatives. It's all about like what, you know, and you know, other ways of arranging ourselves, not just in our kind of own lives and in our familial lives, like how to kind of what modern family might look like. You know, Maeve and her barge community, but also on a larger kind of societal level, how we might arrange ourselves as citizens and as democracies. And so it felt fated in the end. But I did have to do more research for Rona's character, and I was very grateful to a few people who were willing to take Zooms with me and just have me kind of ask very, very basic and roaming questions that must have felt very discombobulating to the people I was asking.
I think it makes it accessible to everyone to, you know, even over here in Australia, New Zealand, to actually understand how democratic processes are working in another country, because it's not the same where, you know, even to America, you know, very different democratic process, yet there's influences and it is all fast moving. Obviously, one of the things that really struck me that I want to touch on is when we get to the middle third, when the sisters actually do find Olwen, who has cycled north, as it were, and is living in a very rustic cabin after 3 months, is that you then switch the structure to a play script. And having been involved in theatre myself, this completely excited me. And the surprise of it, you know, in the written form, you see it written as a play script with the set dialogue for each character and some stage directions. And then when I listened to it, there's multi-narrators coming in, reading it. I mean, it was incredibly exciting, and it really pushes the genre form, which we've seen a bit here lately. Anna Funder, an Australian writer, wrote Wifedom, which was about George Orwell's first wife, Eileen O'Shaughnessy, and she was blending fiction with non-fiction. Also the same with another Australian writer, Richard Flanagan, with Question 7. So recently, and there's been many other authors that have done a similar thing. What was behind your decision to creatively free up that middle section where they meet in the cabin, not reflecting on the past, as it were, but very in the present, thinking about their future, coming together as the sisters who we've learned about separately, to then present it as a play script?
Thanks so much. Yeah, I love that you said that, that it's not so much about dwelling over the past, and that's really key to me. I love that you said that, because I have heard descriptions where, of them going over their childhood traumas, and to me, that's not what I wanted to write. So I was less interested in that story. So, of course it does. There are things that come up about their parents, but that's not, in a way, the novel is also about grief, and it's not about that familial grief. It's the larger, climate grief, and it's not a grief that's located in the past. It's a present moment about what we're losing, which is also another way of talking about what's not yet lost. And that's really where they're invested. The sisters are very much invested in their present lives. They're really committed to the moment. And so it's interesting, because when they're together, they're all still tied into what they're doing. And it's, they're also interested in what in how one another is spending their lives. And that's something that's always fun about adult sibling dynamic, is that you think, okay, we're from the same background, we have very similar DNA, and look how far our lives have spun apart, and the choices that we've made, and you start to assess one another based on the choices, especially financial ones. There's we have one sibling who makes money, and we're very judgmental now, but maybe in the apocalypse we'll need to get on our knees.
I think it's with that play script, I mean, a soft spot for me, because how it's even their relationships with other men in their lives. I mean, they all have a sort of significant male counterpart to their stories in their own life, but we get the introduction of the pub owner, Dan. So how was that? What was the reason behind sort of presenting this as a play script? And then we shift back to the sort of novel prose when we get to the climax, which completely blew me away. Can I just say, I want to say, this is a book for book clubs, because the ending and the build to the ending will have book clubs talking about it long into the night, which I will not give any spoilers, but I did not know where this story would go. I was fascinated when you could see it kind of unrolling, and just those last few pages, or the last, few minutes, you can feel it building, and then where it lands was just so surprising. It was very exciting as a reader, that you feel so drawn into that circumstance, but it's the theatrical part in the middle that has kind of really fleshed out the story in a different way.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm so glad to hear that it worked for you. The play script, because I write in this one draft and I don't like to know anything about. I also didn't know what would happen. I didn't even know the night before I wrote the last few pages. I get a lot quicker when I get to the end of a book in the writing process. I'm very, very, very slow at the beginning, but so yeah, I didn't know, and I didn't know that this play would happen until about 3 pages beforehand. So it wasn't really an intellectual choice, or even an artistic choice. Oh, wouldn't it be cool to change form here? It was actually more of responding to what the characters were going to demand, which was for me to get out of their way.
Right.
And one of the things that happens when I think siblings come together is there's so much talk. And at this point in the novel, I thought, well, the readers now, hopefully the ideal readers will know the sisters well enough now that they'll be able to read between the lines. I don't need to do any interpreting, or leading, and in any case, whose point of view would I privilege? So it was really a way for me to get out of the way and to let them speak. And as you say, I think there's so much in those sections that ramps up kind of the story, because if it were written in prose, it would be at least 100 pages or 200 pages longer. But at that point, all of those kind of how much is sitting between the lines is quite a lot, and the play script really accommodated that,
Mm.
and the play script kind of created space where it might have otherwise felt too dense.
I
And
love that. I think it's the way that I think that banter that happens, it's so natural once we've met them, how they interact with each other and how they interact with other people in the town. I mean, there's very few of them. And in the audio book, it's quite interesting. I mentioned there were multi-narrators. So we have Sarah Bolger reading Rona, Dominique McElligott reading Nell, Aisling Franchosi reading Maeve. We've got Liam Hesling and John Keating who make appearances. But interestingly, you narrate Olwen. And it's not common for a novelist to read their own work for an audiobook. We hear it a lot with memoirs and nonfiction, but not so much with novelists. I know Anne Enright has done it with The Gathering, and there's quite a few other novelists that have had a go. Sarah Winman, who reads Still Life, beautiful. I loved hearing your cadence, your rhythm throughout, because you also had narrated Orkin and the Wasp, your debut novel. So what had led you to decide that you wanted to narrate audiobooks and then also pick that Olwen was going to be the sister that you would read, not one of the others?
Funnily enough, I actually didn't propose myself for this.
Ah,
Yeah, it was suggested to me, and I kind of pushed back a little bit. I said, like, I want to do what's best for the book.
mm,
And I don't know, would it be weird to have professional actors reading the other parts? I was very kind of skeptical, and that, they had listened to the Orchid and the Moss, and they said, no, you'll hold your own.
it's a
And I just
beautiful interpretation, just vocally throughout. Like it really takes you, you get absorbed into the story so easily.
Thank you. That's so kind. But I definitely was. I thought, well, at least Alwyn is first, so that if it had been the other actors coming first, and then I entered the stage, and they're like, "Who's this extra?" But and I had actually suggested a couple of actors for Alwyn, but to me, she has a very particular voice. So there were only particular actors. I think, there was a bit more flexibility with the other characters, but Alwyn, if you don't get the tone of her right, then the tone of the whole book won't make sense. So I was then actually very grateful to get to do it. And it was an amazing process. I think, having done it once before, that was a lot more difficult with the first book, because it was just me, and it was a tricky book to narrate. I had made a lot of choices in terms of the language that on the page, for the ear when you're reading, I hoped would be satisfying, but to actually speak aloud was very difficult. Like, I was always picking Anglo-Saxon words and a lot of monosyllabic words, and so to speak them was actually really tough, especially when you're learning on that learning curve of how to narrate an audiobook.
Did
Um,
it change your writing coming into the third book? Because I know you've talked about before in an interview where you love brown noise and listening to music while you write as part of your process, but then also perhaps narrating an audiobook as your first one and now coming up to your third novel. Has your processes changed in terms of your creativity and getting into the novel and just the physical act of writing and drafting?
the processes have changed, not enough, I feel. I know my partner would love me to find a new process, because my process is not pleasant to be around. I basically have to reach peak self-loathing. That's my
Right.
process. Then I start writing. And then I just tear my hair out for a long time. And then the payoff is in the last third. Like, there's no better time than being in the last third of a book for me, because it is this big gamble of writing into the dark, and it can really happen that you can be a year or even 2 years into a novel and discover that it's actually not a novel,
Mm.
and maybe a short story, or maybe just something that that miscarries in a way. And so, you first of all, when you're in the last third, you know that it's a novel. By then, you know that it's a novel. And also, there's just all that serendipity that happens, where you feel the whole world is reflecting back at the novel, and everything seems relevant, and the world feels more beautiful for that. Nothing feels arbitrary. And so the process hasn't changed, and and now, like, being at the beginning of something now, I'm like, oh dear God, I wish I had a new way of doing things. But you have to write the way that you know how. Like, even if I'm teaching, I'm not, my own method of writing into the dark without a plan, without notes, is not something that I prescribe for students at all. I'm like, if you have a different way of doing it, do that. Do not do.
Do the easier way. But it produces such great work. I know we've come to the end. It's just been fascinating, and I've really enjoyed this opportunity to kind of dissect your thought processes and what your passions are with wanting to get across in the book. I think to every reader that comes into it, I think they're going to draw something out. Like you say, some will identify with different characters, perhaps depending on where they are in the sibling pecking order, whether it's Olwen or Maeve or Rona or Nell. But it's just such a beautiful story. It's an important story, and it really gets you thinking, and that's what I think is the wonderful thing about literature, is that you can have an enjoyable time, but also be stretched to think about the world that we're living in around us. So I just want to thank you for your time today. It's been such a pleasure. Just remember, everyone, that you can access all of Caoilinn Hughes' books on the BorrowBox app, which is your free library app, and you can get it in ebook or audiobook. All of the audiobooks are exclusively through BorrowBox on the BorrowBox app. It's such a wonderful listening experience. You heard Caoilinn reading before, and if you love to have that kind of Irish lilt while you're listening, then make sure you download these books yourself. I want to thank my colleague Bridget, who's been working on the tech scene behind the scenes today, and to Bloomsbury as well for allowing this to happen, especially Genevieve, who's such a wonderful person. And to you, the library lovers, we look forward to bringing you more in conversation events like this, and make sure that you check out our socials and YouTube channel for what's coming up next. So thank you, Caoilinn.
Thank you so much, Natasha, and thanks, BorrowBox. Bye.